Let's talk about confrontation in Frankenstein, particularly looking at chapter 10. So, quick recap from our last lesson. In chapter 9 and 10, Shelley depicts Victor seeking solace in the mountains of the Alps. She throws lots of different types of the sublime at her description, making the environment terrifying, the cause of lofty existential thoughts, and indeed it's a way for Victor to connect to God at times, feeling himself small and insignificant in the grand scheme of things. She used the context of 18th and 19th century mountaineering, a burgeoning hobby amongst the middle classes, to create the sense of her protagonist exploring a dangerous frontier. And all of this builds up to him reaching the top of the mountain, where a biblical-style revelation awaits him. The motif of the mountain serves a structural purpose in this chapter. We know that as Victor climbs to that top of the mountain, he's getting ever closer to the Gothic climax at the centre of the narrative. We're going to go quickly through the chapter from two perspectives, and I'm going to encourage you to evaluate the two of them equally. So the first perspective is the chapter 10 is a Gothic climax argument. The obvious way to interpret the climax of the chapter is that this is the showdown between Victor and his creature, who becomes a kind of nemesis in the way that Shelley describes him. So we previously, in a previous lesson, discussed how the Gothic genre often sees writers employing Manichaean dualism. Do you remember that? That was about the forces of good facing down the forces of evil. And in this very simple reading of the scene at the top of the glacier, Victor has to be a force for good, while his creature takes on perhaps the role of the evil party. Look at the way that Shelley convinces us of this duality. Victor says, "Devil, do you dare reproach me? And do you not fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked upon your miserable head? Begone, vile insect." Now, the violence of Victor's language clearly manipulates the reader into sharing his hatred of the creature. The metaphor of the vile insect otherizes the creature. He's not human, and so therefore we can hate him. Indeed, if we examine the sources for Shelley's scene, this duality is pushed even further. Remember how the epigraph, that little quotation under the title, the epigraph for her novel comes from Milton's epic poem Paradise Lost. In that 17th century text, Milton described how Satan, once he was kicked out of heaven, fell to earth and landed on the top of Mount Niphates, something like that. It's in present-day Armenia anyway, this mountain. Satan falls to the mountain and lands on its summit. In chapter 10, we remember Shelley's choice of epigraph, and we're reminded of the story of Paradise Lost. We're therefore encouraged to think of the creature who suddenly appears at the top of the mountain as the satanic figure, recently booted out of heaven, and that's why he suddenly appears there. So that's all very neat. That's quite a reasonable understanding of the chapter. The Manichaean dualism of the scene tells us that the rest of the novel is going to be a simple narrative of Victor getting his revenge on his creature, a satanic subhuman figure who needs to be punished. Now, that analysis works very well at GCSE, and it's a useful jumping off point for us at A-level. But here's the second interpretation: dual personality theory. Now, the connection between Victor and his creature is very clear. The creature resembles Victor uncannily. So much so that in chapter 10, the creature, in fact, himself identifies the intrinsic connection between himself and Victor. And again, he quotes from Paradise Lost to prove this connection. He demands, "Remember that I am thy monster. I ought to be thy Adam." Now, of course, Adam in the Bible, and therefore also in Paradise Lost, was made in God's image, a replica of God. Now, the Gothic convention of doubling is epitomised in the creature's comment, but maybe Shelley takes this idea of doubling, or a doppelganger, to its natural conclusion. Man looks in a mirror, he doesn't see a copy of himself, he sees himself. What if there was no monster? What if Shelley has spotted an aspect of the human condition that Sigmund Freud would later describe with his theory of the psyche? What if the monster is just a projection of Victor Frankenstein's id, the darkest recesses of his subconscious? Now, remember how Victor recited the stanza from Percy Bysshe Shelley's poem Mutability on his hike up the mountain? That introduced the idea that humans don't control their subconscious. What if Victor's subconscious drove him to commit the heinous acts of killing William and framing Justine, which then led, of course, to her death? To borrow another bit of Freudian psychoanalysis, we human beings sublimate our socially unacceptable impulses. We bury them deep in our subconscious and cover them up with socially conforming actions. I've included in the description of this video a link to an exciting paper by David Urizar in which it's argued that the real monster of the novel is Victor. Now, I suggest that you read the paper in full to explore Urizar's argument in detail, but in summary, the evidence that Shelley gives us that the monster is merely a projection of the darkest parts of Victor's soul include these 3 points. Victor and the creature often speak in nearly identical semantic fields. Their references to the Bible, to Paradise Lost, to fire and the heavens and snowy precipices, and even duties are remarkably similar. Either we're hearing 2 very closely related voices, or, perhaps more simply, just one voice. From chapter 10 onwards, the narrative structure often jumps from the creature's voice to Victor's without any kind of clear signposting. Shelley wants us to be confused between the 2 characters' voices. And Victor is afraid to tell anyone, even his family and beloved Elizabeth, that he's brought a creature to life. Now, this is really strange behaviour from a man who in the novel's early chapters wanted to be able to boast of being the greatest scientist that ever walked the planet. If he'd succeeded in creating an autonomous life in his laboratory, wouldn't he shout it from the rooftops? Instead, he keeps it bottled up, as if ashamed of the real internal monster that he'd created or unleashed. Now, if this is the case, then the confrontation on the top of the mountain, it's not between the forces of good and evil, monster and creator. The confrontation is a far more introspective, inwards-looking one for Victor. In fact, it's a far more romantic confrontation, romantic with a capital R. He confronts the true nature of humanity, and especially the ugly truth of Enlightenment ambition and the destruction it can lead to. So, interpretation 1 or interpretation 2, Gothic climax or romantic introspection. Now, there's obviously not one right answer. It's our job as readers and as students of the novel to find the best evidence that Shelley includes and make an argument on that basis, which is exactly what you're going to do now by writing this essay. Your question is, what does Victor confront at the top of the glacier in chapter 10? For support, you might want to check out the brilliant English Gorillas YouTube lesson on this chapter, which I can highly recommend. It explores some of the language of the chapter in a bit more detail, as well as reinforcing some of the more complicated ideas that we've explored in this video. To push your thinking further, as I've already mentioned, you should read the article that I've linked in the video description. Now, try to evaluate both sides of the argument, or both arguments. Don't be absolutist about one side or the other. Shelley would have hated that, and so you should take your cue from the novelist.